I want to begin by thanking Chloe, Pascal, Florence, all the organizers of this remarkable, shall we say, series of events. I've been talking nonstop since I got here on Monday. And I should think by now you'd all be quite tired of hearing me, but too bad, I'm going to talk some more. More bad news. If you weren't here for the morning session, you missed what was really interesting about the day, because what I'm going to say can't begin to compare to how beautiful the personal testimonies and calls for action that we heard were. I can only try to reflect in a bad theorist's way some of the beauty of their thought. And then what I plan to do is to characterize their comments and then talk about care as a theme, as a way to challenge the speakers a little later in the ways that their organizations might respond to the pandemic. So these 8 reports and sets of demands from struggles during and post-pandemic were both moving. They varied by people's status as citizens, their education, their class, their place in society. But it seemed to me that there were about 6 different calls for responses. And let me just characterize them this way. The one we heard most often was a call for workers' rights. We heard this from Martin Willems, who works with delivery people, who are among the most exploited workers at the moment. They've been turned into piecework workers. That is, they only get paid for each delivery they make. If they sit around and wait for 2 hours for their next call, they don't make any money during those 2 hours. But they have to be there because when the call comes in, if someone else responds first, they lose the money. So they've really been put in this very precarious, difficult work situation. I hope if you call people to deliver your soup, you tip them well. Even though that may not be the custom, they are not getting paid peanuts for the work they're doing. And please think about that. Then we heard also from Evelyn Ayon, Evelyn, who talked about the domestic workers and the Domestic Workers Federation. Again, domestic workers are among the most exploited labor group in the world, actually. There's even a protocol from the International Labor Organization that talks about the conditions of domestic workers, which, by the way, Belgium signed, which, by the way, most of the demands that Evelyn made this morning are still things that are not done in Belgium, even though they're covered by the law. And then we also heard from Hirash Faiza, who is a healthcare worker, to talk about the needs for healthcare workers. We heard calls for housing and for healthcare, which some of us might think about as basic human rights, but as you also all know, not everyone in Belgium has access either to housing or to healthcare. And here we heard from Johan Verhoeven, from Hirash Faiza, and we also heard from Laurent Dursul on the condition of people he doesn't want to call the homeless, but the immense. Then we heard a call for papers from people who are sans-papiers, who, again, this is partly about working conditions, but it's also about the extraordinary precarity that you are in the state here if you don't have papers. And Evelyn mentioned this as well, using the language that the Belgian state is rather sneaky. I like that way of putting it, because if you don't have papers, you can't get health access, you can't get a pass to the metro, you can't get all kinds of benefits that normally accord to citizens. Then we heard a call for social transformation of the family from forgive my half English, half French, from the group of solo parents. Yeah, I have down here, Maison of Solo Parents. because they also experienced extraordinary difficulties under the conditions of the pandemic. Maybe you didn't think about this, but if only one person was allowed in a shop to shop at a particular time, what do you do if you went to the shop with your 5-year-old? Right. So, but they then made much more radical demands about the need to transform the family, the need to think differently about what a family is, about how we organize family units, about men's responsibilities to families. We heard a call, fifthly, for social transformation of the position of the homeless. Well, I don't have time to engage Laurent's playful and critical analysis of care, but at any rate, he suggested that we really need to think about the way in which we even the language of homeless is already to put people in a position of there's something missing there, rather than thinking of them in some other ways. Finally, there was I'm going to characterize Astrid Ake's talk about Occupy La Monnaie as a call for public space. It was more than that, but it was certainly, and I think in some important ways, that cultural workers need to be able to have access to public space, and they don't if you keep your cultural institutions locked up and only accessible to some. It was also a demand about homelessness and about housing. There were lots of things going on there. It made us all feel better to think about how successful the trash bin at the Prime Minister's house was. So now let me talk about how care shows up as a theme across this disparate set of demands. First of all, it obviously shows up in terms of care work. That is the work that both paid and unpaid caregivers do. So obviously care is involved here in the ways in which care work was a fundamental matter that everybody was talking about. Now, both paid and unpaid care were discussed. Delivery people, healthcare workers, domestic workers, if they get paid. We're talking about paid work. They don't, by the way, always get paid. They sometimes get cheated out of their wages. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But also solo parents trying to take care of their kids are doing care work, even though it's not paid. And Asia, in describing the occupation of the church by hunger strikers trying to get papers, you probably know the decision today came down today to extend papers only to one of all those women who was there. But she pointed out that those women also faced a struggle during the hunger strike between taking care of their own families and continuing their political activity. I mean, there is a kind of care dilemma that we see all the time. So there was a lot of talk about care, and there always is, if we actually focus on what the political issues that are driving people's lives are about. But there's another question too, and it came up a little bit, Astrid addressed it. What is the role of care in struggles themselves? Because if you don't take care of the organization, the people who are engaged in trying to make change, it won't last. Sadly, several, I think 2 of the organizations that we heard about this morning, well, maybe one, maybe it's, at least some of them don't exist any longer. They decided just to disband. And that's not unusual when you're doing social change, that a group exists for a while and then it goes out of existence. But if you're committed to change over the long term, you may need to really begin to adjust what care is going to be within the movement. Example, in the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, those brilliant, mostly women leaders are actually spending a fair amount of time thinking about how they care for themselves at the same time they engage in ongoing struggle. Laurent asked the question whether care is even a good idea, because he wanted to ask us to think not only about care, but also about not only about needs, but also about wants and desires. And it's complicated, and we need always to be thinking on all those levels. But I want to devote the most of my time here then to talking about what can institutions and institutional actors do. There are the demands from civil society, there are institutional actors, there's the state. How can they respond to those demands? Well, of course, they can be uncaring and simply deny them or ignore them, which happens sometimes. Or they can be attentive to the needs, wants, and desires of the people. And civil society organizations are one way to express those. The second thing they can do is, and last night I was critical of what I called protective care, but what I want to say is a different way to think about it is supportive care. It's possible to think of the state and of other large institutions in the society, and for that matter, even private enterprises, if they wanted to do so. Hint, they mostly don't, unless they're going to make a profit. And that is to support care. It's possible to support care without telling people how to do it. It's possible to support care, leaving it pluralistically up to individuals and groups to figure out how they best understand care should happen. And we heard today about the need for housing, about the need for workers' rights, and about the need to solve the migration problem. I want to talk about migration for just a moment longer. Already back in 2005, I published an essay that people mostly ignore because they think it's crazy. I'll tell you about it. I made the argument, I've always made the argument that care is a relationship. And it's not only a relationship between the caregiver and the care receiver, it's also a relationship between the care receiver and the caregiver. So here is my simple proposition. If you're engaged in a care relationship with a citizen, you are a citizen of that country, period. So if you come here and you work for a Belgian family taking care of their children, you're a Belgian citizen. If you send money home to take care of your children, because that's why you came to Belgium, to make money so you could support your family at home, they're in a relationship with a Belgian citizen, you. They're Belgian citizens too. If you want to be a citizen of the Philippines, as the Belgian person who hires a Philippine worker, you can too. It's mind-boggling when you think about the different and complex relationships that humans have as each other, but which states refuse to recognize. But imagine if we forced the states to recognize all those relations. The reason I think it's important for us to try to expand our mind even to these kinds of crazy ideas is because it helps us to put in perspective what we're doing, using, and changing, for example, in the global care crisis. As the population of the world ages, much of the care work that is being done in the world is being done by women from the third world, either in the third world or in the third world, or in the more developed, economically higher income countries. And this trend is continuing, and workers trained in health, untrained workers, all of them are moving from the less well-off countries to the better off countries. It's a kind of injustice that drains the resources of countries in the world. And I think if we were to think differently about what those relationships actually are, if we started to think of them as relations of citizens, it would change a great deal. At the moment, migrant workers almost everywhere in the world are at best partial citizens. That's Rachel Pareñas's wonderful phrase. That is, they're here. They may even have a bus pass. They may even have health care. But what they don't have is the condition to go to the police if they're harmed. What they don't have is the condition to sue in court if they're being shortchanged. And those things mean that they are likely to be completely exploited. So we have to figure out a way to end that kind of exploitation. It won't be enough for one country to say, okay, from now on, we will treat everyone in our borders as legal. It really has to be a worldwide solution to what's really a worldwide problem. So I was describing what institutions and institutional actors can do. And I had said they could be attentive to needs, desires, and wants. And second, they could support care. Two more. Third thing they can do, they can think about responsibility. Now, this is, I think, one of the most important things we can learn from using a care analysis, but something we often forget to do. And that is, within any organization, within any process, there are levels and different forms of responsibility. Increasingly, what capitalist enterprises have done is to determine ways to avoid responsibility for the things they do. Right? It's part of what powerful people always do, avoid responsibility. Here's an example. It was in an essay called Responsibility, Inc., written by Robert Goodwin a long time ago. He said there was, back in the 80s, there was a big oil tanker, the Exxon Valdez, that broke apart off the coast of Alaska, and it just despoiled thousands of acres and killed lots and lots of wildlife. They couldn't figure out who to sue because the company actually didn't own the boat. The boat was owned by it. It was such a complex legal system that you couldn't actually figure out who owned that ship. And so the captain, who by the way was drunk, was the person who was held responsible for all this damage. But he wasn't the one who was really, I mean, he was responsible in a way, but a leaky ship off the coast of Alaska, there were other responsible parties there, right? But they had a way of making it look not that way. Evelyn explained that at the moment here in Brussels, hotels subcontract their cleaning. They don't hire the cleaners. A company called All Clean, in this case, hires the cleaners. They don't pay the workers, but if she goes to Marriott and says, pay me, they say, well, we don't have anything to do with you. We don't even know who you are. What are you doing here? And this capacity to shift responsibility and become irresponsible is one of the most important forms of power that we have to be looking for all the time. The last thing that institutions could do, so that was 3, here's 4, is democratize. Every institution that we work in part because it's the nature of our lives, has a hierarchy of command and a hierarchy of organization. The more we can flatten organizations, the more democratic we can make them, the more responsive we can make the people at the top to the people at the bottom, the more we stop thinking about the difference between top and bottom, the more likely we are to actually hear what's going on in the organization and be able to respond to needs. Now, an organizational chart accomplishes lots of things. People have to have different jobs, but there's been a tendency to add layer upon layer of management, which again, separates the responsibilities from the actual work being done, and which keeps the problems which are happening down at the level of, say, the nurse on the floor from ever getting back up to the management. So the more you can democratize any institution you're in, the more likely you are to be able to make it caring. In the long term, is that okay? And shall I just say some concluding things? In the long term, what will come from this pandemic? A nurse wrote to the New York Times not too long ago. For a while, we thought that we saw the light at the end of the tunnel of the pandemic. But maybe what we're really going to have to do is learn to see in the dark. The pandemic is not going away. It will change, or there will be another one. We are going to have to live with ongoing threats and risk to our health. And the question is, how do we keep the pandemic from being an excuse not to act on all these other issues that it has made worse for us? I want to end by being hopeful by saying 2 things about political possibilities. First, Francis Fox Piven and Richard Cloward in the 1930s studied poor people's movements, where, by the way, there were lots of occupations of buildings in New York City. I'm surprised there haven't been more now. But what Piven and Cloward said is it's when a crack appears in the system that we begin to mobilize. People's lives are always in trouble. But the question is the trouble of having a child whose school day doesn't match your work day, is that trouble yours or is it a social problem? If you see it as your problem, you're not going to do anything about it. But if you start to see it as a social problem, what is wrong with those people at the school board that they don't realize when people work? If you begin to see these as problems that are more social, then you will begin to make change. And what's happening with the pandemic is that a lot, and this is part of the reason why political leaders are so anxious, is because the cracks in the system are beginning to show. We should use that in order to make larger change. Second, for those of you who are young and thinking about careers, and I hope you'll think about careers in public life, because it's actually really important, leaders can lead. I know that sounds silly anymore because so many political leaders don't, but leaders can really make a difference. If you change the tone of the conversation, if you change the terms of the debate, if you change how policies are signed, they can signal to people that we are in fact in it together or not. They can signal to people that we have your back, we're going to watch out for you or not. And the more we can do to make people feel that they're safe, the more likely they are to be able to think creatively about the huge problems, including climate change, that are facing us. So if people feel frustrated and apolitical and fearful, they're not going to make change. But if leaders provide them with some opportunity to think about the world differently, then they can. And they do, and they have, and we will. Thank you.